Hello students, this is a consolidation video on modal verbs. How many modal verbs can you recall? There are different modal verbs to serve different purposes. Well, on the screen, here are some examples of modal verbs that we have learned. Do you still remember how to use the modal verbs? A modal verb is followed by a verb in base form. Say for example, I want to advise you to eat more vegetables. I would use the modal verb should. Here I would use the modal verb should with the base form of eat. The sentence is then, you should eat more vegetables. And of course, other than should, we have other different modal verbs serving different purposes other than giving advice. In this video, we'll focus on 3 groups of new modal verbs we've learned this year. They are modal verbs used to express obligation, modal verbs used to give advice, and also modal verbs used to express preferences. Alright, so the first group we are looking at would be the modal verbs used to give advice. They are ought to, should, and had better. Let's take a look at should and ought to first. We use both to give positive or negative advice, and we usually ask questions with should. Note how the modal verb is followed by the verb in base form. In should be is the verb in base form. When the verb is in negative form, the verb in base form follows the not or the shortened form shouldn't. When we ask a question, the verb in base form follows the subject, which is after the modal verb. So that's how we use should in a sentence or a question. When we use ought to, we can use it in positive or negative advices as well. When it's positive, we use a verb in base form right after ought to. When the verb is negative, we put not in between ought and to. Other than should and ought to, we can also use had better to give advice. Now, pay attention, when we use had better, we use a verb in base form afterwards. For example, you had better listen to what he has to say, or they had better not talk now. So when the advice is negative, we put not right after had better. We can shorten had better to apostrophe D, better. So that's you'd better or they'd better, not. Well, we usually use had better when something bad may happen if someone does not do something. When we want to give more polite or gentle advice, that means we don't want to force the others to do something. We can ask a question with these 2 phrases instead. We can use why not or why don't you? So let's take a look at the sample sentences. Why not stop arguing and start working? After why not, we use a verb in base form. While after why don't you, we also use a verb in base form. Next, let's take a look at modals which are used to express obligation, must and have to. Well, both have to and must are used to talk about necessity and obligation, whether you need to do something or it's your responsibility or it's because of the law or because of the rule that you need to do something. Have to and must are slightly different in the sense that have to is used to talk about something objective. That means you have the obligation to do something because of some external rules or obligations. It's not your opinion, but it's according to some objective existing rules. On the other hand, must is more subjective. That means I talk about this obligation or necessity subjectively. That means it's probably only your opinion that someone needs to do something. Someone has the responsibility to do something. So now let's take a look at how have to and must are used both positively and negatively or in questions. So has to is used after the subject. So make sure that your verb agrees with the subject. After she, we need to change have to has. After has to, we use the verb in base form. The negative form of have to or has to would be do not have to or don't have to in the simple present tense. After this chunk, we use a verb in base form. When we are asking a question, we put do in front of the subject. Do I have to join? So the word join is also in base form after have to. On the other hand, we use must like this. We use the verb in base form after must. When it is in negative form, we do not change must after the subject. No matter which subject you use, we still use the word must, and we put the not behind must. We can also contract it to mustn't. After must not or mustn't, we use the verb in base form. When we ask a question, must is placed in front of the subject, followed by the verb in base form. So this is how you use have to and must. Moving on to the third group of modals we are focusing in this video, the modals used to express preferences. That means whether you would choose one thing over the other. What would you choose when you're given two choices? So we call that preferences. We use would rather or the short form apostrophe D rather, or would prefer the short form apostrophe D prefer. We use would rather and prefer differently in a sentence. Let's take a look at would rather first. Would rather is usually used with the word than to compare two choices. We use it to talk about what we want to do, talk about the action which is preferred over another action. The base form of the verb is put after would rather and then. Say for example, I would rather go by bus than take a taxi. So the two choices would be go by bus and take a taxi. So here, after would rather, we use the verb in base form go, and after then, we also use the verb in base form take. In a negative sentence, we add the word not after would rather. And similarly, we use a verb in base form after would rather not. Next, let's take a look at how we can use prefer in a sentence. We use prefer to say which thing or action is preferred when comparing two things or actions. That means which one you want more. We use a noun or noun phrase after prefer and to when comparing two things. Well, if that two things are not tangible things, but actions, then we would use a gerund to put after prefer and to when comparing two actions. A gerund or a to infinitive can be put after prefer when we talk about something we like to do in general, but we are not comparing two things. So let's take a look at them one by one. First of all, we prefer outdoor markets to shopping centers. So both outdoor markets and shopping centers are nouns, the two choices we choose from. In the sentence, Anne prefers working out to being a couch potato. We are comparing two actions, work out and be a couch potato. Here we need to change the action to the gerund. When we're not comparing, but only telling people what we like to do, we can use either the gerund or the to infinitive. So here, the students prefer donating, or the students prefer to donate money to the food bank. And lastly, how do we form the negative sentence? We put the word not after prefer. So for example, in the sentence, Dave prefers not giving up, or Dave prefers not to give up work. Here we can use either the gerund or the infinitive because we are only telling people what we like in general, but not what we'll choose out of two choices. Alright, so now let's do some exercise to see whether you have understood. Alright, we should choose the best option to fill in the blank to complete the sentence. Number 1, something, eat here or go to a restaurant. The answer is quite obvious because we know that we are offering two choices for people to choose from, for people to show their preference. So when we're talking about preferences, we use would rather. So the best option here would be C, would you rather. And of course, when we use would rather, it's better to use than to differentiate the two choices. So when you answer the question, you would say, I would rather eat here than go to a restaurant. Question number 2. The air conditioning is really cold in that restaurant. Something bring a jacket. So I guess this is an advice for people who haven't been to this restaurant yet. The modals we can use to give advice with would be ought to, should, and had better. Well, the first one is not correct because ought usually goes with to. Actually, ought always stick with to as a modal. So A is wrong. And let's take a look at option C. You should have. Now, when we say should have, you mean that you could have done better for some past actions or past events. You didn't do that in the past, and you should have done that in the past. So after should have, it's usually followed by a verb in PP form. However, after the blank, we have a verb in base form instead. So here, B would be the choice. Moving on to question 3. Jack said, did your parents enjoy the trip to Europe? Jill said, they spent more money than they expected. They blah blah. So here, the they means Jill's parents. It shows that if they were given the choice to do something else, they would have chosen another choice. So talking about choices, we are talking about preferences. The only option talking about preference would be B. Now B is a very long answer. Let's take a look at the structure of the answer. First of all, we have would rather, and this would rather is used in the negative sense, so a not is added. So if Jill's parents were given a choice to choose again, they would not have done the same. So here it's would rather not. And after not, we have gone, have in verb base form. However, have gone implies something in the perfect sense. So have gone means it is a regret. So Jill's parents cannot change the past, but if they had another chance, they would have chosen differently. So it's like the conditional type 3. Question 4. Students something laugh or have loud conversations in the library. So here we are talking about what students are supposed to do or not to do according to the rules in the library. We are talking about obligations here. So here only options A and B seem to be containing modal verbs for obligation. So let's take a look at them one by one. A, ought not to, and B, have not to. So looking at option B, we know that this is not correct because we know the negative form of have to should be do not have to. Well, pay attention that do not have to actually has a different meaning from must not. Alright, so here option A would be the answer. Ought not to is the negative form of ought to. Students ought not to laugh or have loud conversations in the library. Question 5. I something to watch television at home tonight. It is so cold outside. So this I is saying, I'm choosing to stay at home because outside is so cold. We are talking about a preference here. Therefore, B is the answer because B is the only modal verb talking about preferences. I'd prefer to watch television at home tonight. It is so cold outside. Question 6. Nancy something eat too much sweets. She has diabetes. So diabetes is a disease where you have too much sugar in your blood. So if you have too much sugar in your blood and your body is unable to change that sugar into something else, then you have diabetes. Therefore, Nancy is actually not supposed to eat too much sweets. So I would say this is an advice for Nancy to follow. So which of the following options would be the best to fit into the blank? Okay, let's take a look. Is it ought to not, must not to, or ought not to? So this question is actually testing whether you know how to form the negative form of the modal verbs. Looking at A to C, only C is a correct negative form. So here the answer should be C, ought not to. Nancy ought not to eat too much sweets. She has diabetes. So what about if we change the wordings a little bit? Nancy eat less sweets. She has diabetes. We are still talking about advice. So what would be the answer here? Let's take a look at the options one by one. A, had better to eat. Now, if we recall what we've learned after had better, what form of the verb should we add afterwards? Do we need to? No, we do not. So A is not a correct answer. Is it B? Alright, before we choose B, let's take a look at the option C as well. Nancy should have eat. This is also not correct because we usually use should have to talk about how we can do things better if we were in a same situation, talking about regrets in the past or how you could have done better in the imaginary past situation. Okay, so here after should have, normally we use a verb in PP form. However, here it is in base form. Therefore, the answer is B. Question 7. Janet was late for school this morning. She set her alarm clock yesterday night. So we are talking about how Janet could have done better. We're talking about an imaginary past that we cannot change. We're just saying, oh, she could have done better. So which option should we choose? Now here actually we're talking about an advice, advising Janet to do better next time, or what she could have done in such a situation. So the best answer here would be should have. We are choosing should have because we are talking about a past situation. How Janet could have done better. Question 8. I something. Cook by myself, then eat out. It is healthier. So it is healthier is the reason for the choice of this I in front. So the word then is a very important keyword. Which modal do we use with then? Yes, the answer is C. I'd rather cook by myself than eat out. It is healthier. Number 9. Something go hiking today. The weather is perfect, neither too humid nor hot. So here this person is trying to give advice or suggestion to others on what to do by asking a question. So here, which option should we choose? Now, when we are asking a question, we use either why don't or why not. So pay attention. What word should we put right after why don't and why not? Well, for why don't, we usually follow this phrase with a pronoun. For example, why don't we do something? And for why not, we follow the phrase with a verb in base form, such as why not go there? So the answer is very obvious. Go here is a verb in base form. The answer is then B. Question 10. Something joined at least 3 ECA clubs in school this year. The student asked Mr. Young. So this student is trying to clarify some rules with Mr. Young. We're talking about obligation here. The tricky thing here is we need to know how we use modals to form a question. Let's take a look at the options. A. Mustn't to. Must I to join? Now this is absolutely wrong because when we ask a question, we usually say only must I and then the verb in base form. So in this case, must I join? So A is not correct. How about option B? Do and have to. Do I have to join? Well, everything fits. And let's check option C as well. Had and I join. That would definitely be incorrect because the subject I is repeated. So the answer is B. Coming to the last bonus question. Mabel has a meeting at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning, so she come to our gathering. So this question is not about the modals focused earlier in the previous questions. This is testing your previous knowledge on other modals as well. So here we are talking about the ability or availability of Mabel. So Mabel is not able to come to the gathering because of a meeting. Here, you are tested on the negative form of the modal verb, talking about availability. Let's take a look at the 3 options. A. Will not, can. Now this one is absolutely incorrect. But a lot of students would make such kind of mistakes. Remember, the negative form of can in the future tense is not will not, can. Alright, let's take a look at option B. Will, can't. Well, will is in itself a modal verb. 2 modal verbs won't go together. So here we cannot say will, can't. That leaves us with the last option, C. C is actually the correct answer. Will not be able to. So when you want to talk about ability in the future, you should use will not be able to instead of using the word can. Great, we have finished revising the grammar item modals. If you have further questions, ask your teachers.